You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're excited to welcome Dr. Dave Caudel, Executive Director at the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation. Dave's passion for understanding how things work has driven his career, and his diagnosis of Asperger syndrome gives him a unique perspective. As a father of 3 children on the spectrum, he's motivated to improve the world for neurodivergent individuals. The Frist Center, housed at Vanderbilt School of Engineering, aims to transform workplaces using new technologies tailored to the skills and talents of people with autism. Welcome, Dave Caudel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'd like to add one clarifier to it. It is the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation, but we're not just thinking of all of the autism spectrum. We're thinking of all of neurodivergence.
Okay, and I think that's important.
So what is needed for neurodivergent individuals to find and thrive in meaningful employment from a strengths-based perspective?
Okay, and I think as we go through is that you're going to be able to highlight what that actually means, what that looks like, and where we're succeeding and failing as a community. But before we go down the route of really digging deep, I'd love for you just to share a little bit about your personal journey as a self-advocate and parent, and what has driven you to become such an advocate and working at the Frist Center.
Yeah, well, I mean, my whole life, I knew that I was weird and different. I mean, from my own perspective, I was perfectly fine. I was perfectly rational. I was perfectly logical. Like the way I thought about things and the way I analyzed problems and solutions for me felt very logical. And when I would describe, my methodology for arriving to decisions and stuff, most people could follow along with that. And so, I knew that in a lot of ways my brain was working properly. But I also knew that I had difficulty understanding people. They seemed to say and do bizarre things. They didn't seem to make any logical sense or any sort of rational sense. I was about 13 when I came to the conclusion that everybody at my school was insane. That was a weird thing to sort of like discover. But by the time I was 14, I made a more disturbing discovery that they were all insane in the same way. That obviously there was a methodology for what they say or don't say or what they choose to do or how they respond to each other. It's just I was missing something and it didn't make sense to me. At one point, I was convinced people were taking secret night classes that were teaching them all these hidden social rules that I just couldn't figure out. And so I had a lot of struggles. It's very common for neurodivergent individuals. Something we all have in common is we live in a world that's not optimized for us. It was optimized for the masses. And when you're wired differently, that means that you have a different perspective. That means that you use language differently. Some of the variables in your equation may be different in terms of the emphasis and stuff. And there are many upsides to being neurodivergent, but one of the big downsides is because we're wired differently, what works well for the masses doesn't always work well for us, and sometimes it's harmful for us. So my whole life, I knew I was weird. I knew I was different. I spent many, many years struggling and suffering in the professional world before I found a way to make my weirdness work, found a way to interpret people so I could more accurately understand them, found a way to speak to people in a certain way so they're less likely to misunderstand me, and things got better. So by the time I was in my 30s and gave this college thing a try to see what that was all about, is the first time I discovered that I was autistic. Right about the same time I was discovering science and falling in love with physics, I discovered that I was autistic and got a formal diagnosis. And I had a lot of pushback in the beginning. I was offended, actually, when somebody suggested that I had Asperger syndrome. But through my study and research, I realized I had a lot of misconceptions and I could actually be on the spectrum. And by the time that kicked off a year of study and research and figuring out neurodivergence, figuring out autism, trying to find where I land in that whole spectrum. But in that journey, I came to a more complex and nuanced understanding of myself, why I'm different, why I struggle with things that other people don't seem to struggle with, why are some things easy for me that are not easy for most people. And paradoxically, that helped me to understand normal people better as well. Because I would look at an autistic trait and go, oh, well, this isn't something that most people go through. Now some of their words or deeds or actions start to make a little bit more sense. So in my journey of discovery, I had a better understanding of myself. I had a better understanding of my species and my place within that species, which had immediate positive benefits in interacting with people. And I immediately started advocating for myself and other people. Because one of the things I realized is I could have found this diagnosis a lot sooner, could have made my life easier in a lot of important ways a lot sooner. It could have really shortened that 20-year period of pain and suffering. It could have shortened or diminished that if I had known. The reason I didn't know is because as a society, we have so many misconceptions and misunderstandings. I mean, I was just as guilty as everybody else. I learned what I knew from autism from Hollywood. And Hollywood is not a good place to go to figure out how things actually work and what's accurate. You know, they're more interested in a good story or a good narrative as opposed to actually giving people factual, useful information that would give them, you know, a good jumping off point to learn more about something. And so I got into the advocacy work to try to educate the public, to try to help people kind of understand. In part, so people will misunderstand me a little bit less and maybe more willing to give me the accommodations I need to thrive and be successful in professional environments. And also in part, so maybe they'd be a little bit better the next time they interact with a neurodivergent person. And finally, I recognized that there were other autistic people out there. The majority of autistic adults are undiagnosed. Many of them don't even realize they're autistic. And so if we can get the truth and best practices and an actual factual understanding of this condition out into the public, how many people who are autistic come across that good info and go, oh, wait a minute, this kind of describes some of the struggles I'm going through, and then starts down the same rabbit hole I went down. So there was a lot of good reasons why I wanted to do it. But you certainly pointed out, once I realized my kids were also on the autism spectrum, there was also more of a personal, I want to see them grow up in a world, like any parent, I don't want them to suffer as much as I did. I want them to have a better life. I want them to have an easier life. I want them to struggle less than I had to get to where I was. So for all of those reasons, this is, self-advocacy has been a passion of mine for the last 15 years, and I love it.
Well, I mean, I think it's the passion that creates the discovery and also creates some of the resolutions. And you had mentioned this journey of discovery. During that time, I would imagine is that there were so many barriers, and we're going to get to the workplace, but I think that's way down the line, the number of barriers that might have been accumulating over time, whether it's through the way that folks learn, is that we all learn differently, but somebody who's neurodivergent might be on a completely different path of learning and need to kind of experience things in a different way to be able to gain the information and not what would be the typical learning model. And the same thing with kind of some of the social aspects is that you can easily be pigeonholed into kind of a different path by not being able to understand or being able to accept or be a part of what would be the typical social experience. And instead of folks realizing is that I need to be open and explore different perspectives, different lived experiences, and be more welcoming, is that we create these inherent barriers. What are some of these barriers that you ran into or that you're still seeing through the education process that folks are running into before workplace?
If we're talking about education in particular, we're by necessity taking a subsegment of the autism spectrum population. Obviously, someone with ASD level 3, moderate to severe intellectual disabilities, non-speaking, minimally speaking, have a lot of profound challenges and stuff that this isn't high on the radar. But for those of us who are capable of going to college, who are capable of us for higher learning or capable of full-time employment, I'd say bar none, the biggest barrier for us is misunderstandings and miscommunication. When your brain is wired differently than most people, then not only is your perspective a bit different than most people, but even the way you use language is different than most people. We all use the same words, but sometimes they have different meanings. And that's not just true with autism and people within the neuromajority. That's also true, like comparing academia to the corporate environment or whatever. And so, you know, at its core, so what do we need to thrive and be successful? Like, we need the people we're interacting to understand at some level that we use language differently. And in the case of autistic people, that means we're very literal speakers. We're very blunt and direct in our language. We don't use tone of voice, or we don't use wink, wink, nudge, nudge body language to change the meaning of what we're saying. You know, I like to joke, if you ever wonder, I wonder what Dave meant when he said X. I'm like, get a dictionary, understand sentence structure, piece it together. That is literally what I meant. Like, there was no hidden subtext or anything in that. I'm very blunt and direct in my language. But some people, when they hear someone being very blunt and direct, they can misinterpret that. Like, oh, this person's trying to be a jerk, or this person's unhappy about something, or this person doesn't like me, or whatever. You know, there's all these sort of value judgments. If they see us avoiding eye contact, or minimum eye contact, or something about our body language is awkward or uncomfortable, and this person's hiding something, this person's trying to screw me over, or whatever. Like, people jump to all sorts of conclusions because they take their instincts that work pretty well for the neuromajority. Like, if you're in the neuromajority and you're interacting with somebody whose brain is wired very similar to yours, then those sort of instincts are on point. Like, those are really good instincts to pick up on the subtle things. But if you're talking to somebody with a different brain, a different type of brain, all of those assumptions you're making are wrong. They're wrong-headed. They're leading you to the wrong conclusions, i.e. misunderstandings and miscommunications. So to advocate for myself, it's been a long, perilous journey of trying to figure out, how do I interact with you in such a way that I'm able to impart or help you to understand that my brain works differently, I use language differently, there might be some misunderstandings or miscommunications. For you, I need you to be a little bit more mindful and intentional to make sure that your words match what you're trying to say. You know, that you try to avoid the normal ways of talking, of saying one thing and meaning something else, but being a little bit more explicit and direct. And by the same token, if I come across too blunt or direct or thoughtless, like, I need to foster an environment where you feel comfortable going, hey, the way you said that to me was unacceptable. Or I think you're being, you know, that's coming across as too crude or too direct, or whatever, that we're both able to effectively communicate with each other. Now, in all of these workplaces and stuff where you see, you know, this is a population, 80% unemployed or underemployed. 80%. That's higher than any other disability or difference in this country. Way, way higher than anybody else. I would say a vast majority of that for ASD level 1s is misunderstanding and miscommunications. And a failure, because if we can't effectively and authentically communicate with each other in such a way that we each understand where the other person's coming from or what the other person is trying to convey, that's when problems multiply, build up, misunderstandings multiply and build up. So we have to find a way to get to where you can kind of understand me and I can kind of understand you. And then a lot of those problems suddenly become solvable and manageable.
Well, I mean, just through your experience, and you've been able to engage and talk with a lot of people that are neurodivergent and have different skills and different abilities and process differently. But one of the commonalities I would imagine you're constantly running into is underemployment or lack of opportunity, lack of advancement, maybe even being let go from jobs that it really doesn't make sense if you actually understood the person, and maybe they're being terminated without good cause. Like, it seems like there's some major things that could occur in the workplace, and then there's some other things that are, you know, just minor skills that just kind of help to advance, whether it's teaching the workplace how to do it correctly so that somebody who is neurodivergent can benefit, or teaching the person who's neurodivergent how others might be perceiving some of the actions, just so that they're able to communicate, like you said, and say, you know what, I'm not trying to be offensive here, but this is who I am. I'm trying to be able to talk through and be honest and be direct. So what are some of the inherent challenges? If you were to pick a couple, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing in the workplace that are due to this misunderstanding, miscommunication of neurodivergence?
Yeah, something that the neuromajority seems to be completely unaware of is that they are extraordinarily harsh and judgy, that the people around them walk and talk and act in just the right way. I mean, there's a bit of flexibility in there, but they have pretty strict guidelines on that. And so if they see anybody who walks or talks or acts in any sort of like deviant way, they tend to jump to conclusions. They tend to be harsh conclusions. They start to dehumanize that person. They start to isolate that person. That person becomes the other, and that's when the pack turns on that individual. And that's the sort of thing that happens to autistic and neurodivergent people far too often. It's all rooted in those sort of like misunderstandings that we were talking about earlier. So the thing when I'm, my advice to people depends on who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to a neurodivergent person, I'm trying to help them learn how to mask or meet halfway in a way to kind of get to know this person. Because if we know somebody a little bit better, some of those problems go away.
Mm-hmm.
Every human being, whether we realize it or not, every time we encounter another human being, we are subconsciously making a calculation. Are you a part of my tribe,
mm-hmm.
or are you the other? And if I get a sense that you're a part of my tribe, then everything you say or do, I'm going to give you a bit of grace. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to try to resolve conflicts. I'm going to try not to think too harshly about your words or actions and stuff. I'm going to look at you like a human being who has value and is a part of the society. But if we move the person to the other, we're capable of astonishingly cruel, evil, and horrific things. And that's just in our heritage, our genetic heritage and stuff. Maybe 10, 20,000 years ago, it served our ancestors really well. But today in the modern world, it's really screwing us over and really holding us back from reaching the next stage of our species development. So the big thing I try to stress to the neuromajority is try to have some awareness of how extraordinarily harsh and judgy you are. If you really had an accurate understanding of it, I think more than a little bit of shame would boil up inside of you. And I would hope that the answer to that is to be a little bit more graceful, a little bit more open-minded, a little bit more forgiving. I'm not asking you to compromise your morals. I'm not asking you to compromise your philosophy. Stop jumping to so many conclusions. If you see somebody that says or does something and your mind is like, how on earth did that person possibly think that was okay to say or do? And then you start jumping to conclusions. Well, they must be a monster. They must be narcissistic. They must not care about everybody. I want you to have a little voice in your head that goes, hey, maybe they're neurodivergent. Maybe they're wired a bit differently than me. Yeah, I know that seems so obvious to you, but what's obvious to you is not obvious to everyone. It's obvious to you because of the way your brain is wired, because of the way you process information. That's why it's so obvious to you. If it seems that this person is doing something really boneheaded, maybe it's not obvious to them. Have the benefit of the doubt. Don't jump to a conclusion. Ask some follow-up questions. Try to do a little digging to try to figure out, the nice thing about dealing with an autistic person is that if I'm being a jerk to you and you come to me, we tend to be very honest and blunt and direct. And you go, are you trying to be a jerk? And I would be like, yeah, I'm mad at you because the other day you did this. We'll at least be honest with it. We'll say it out. But if I go, no, I'm not trying to be a jerk, you can go, yeah, really, because it feels like you're trying to be a jerk. That's a classic sign of maybe there's a disconnect or a misunderstanding. And when you realize that someone's not trying to be a jerk, that someone is trying to engage you, suddenly it changes your calculus, right? It changes how you think about the person. It changes how you approach the person. The first time I entered a society where I was widely accepted and just rolled into the society and it was a glorious time. It was the first time I went to a foreign country. When I was deployed in Honduras, despite the fact that my Spanish was terrible, their English was not too better, so there was a huge language barrier there. I formed a lot of friendships and relationships within the Honduran community there, and I was invited over to people's houses for dinner, and we'd hang out and do things together. And I thought, how weird is this that I had to go to another country where I could just click with people and get along with people? And same thing happened in Bosnia. The same thing happened in Serbia. The same thing happened in Germany. The same thing happened in Amsterdam. And at some stage, I thought, well, this is before I got my formal diagnosis. I thought, well, maybe my people skills have just gotten better. And then I came back to the States and said, oh, no, it's the States. That's what I thought at the time. Then I got my diagnosis, and I looked back at it with a more nuanced understanding. And then I realized, when I'm in Honduras, when I'm in Germany, those people see me, and their first identity is this is a foreigner. This is someone from a different country. And so what was actually happening is I got a little bit more grace.
Yeah, more patience.
More wiggle room. right? They give me more wiggle room. And so if I did something a little weird or unusual, they go, well, maybe that's not what they do in the States, you know? And so they were more accepting and accommodating. And that allowed me to get over that first hump. Yeah. And then once they got past that, they saw that I was a caring, compassionate human being who does actually treat people around me like they have agency and value, you know, and I just basically a good, wholesome human being to kind of get to know and stuff. But here in the States, or any sort of culture where people see me and hear my accent and see my skin color and make the assumption I'm a part of the same culture as them, that's when they get really harsh and judgy without realizing it. So it's going to sound weird, but I just want neuromajority people to treat neurodivergent people like they're foreigners. Stop holding us at such an unreasonable expectation. Give us the space to be a little weird or unusual and odd or different, and try to look past that and try to get to know us. And more often than not, you'll find out we're actually pretty good people.
Well, I mean, and as unique as that is, as that perspective, it sounds like the correct approach, and we haven't necessarily taken this from the get-go. And what's kind of one of the things that I think I really appreciate about the Frist Center and the way that they're going about matching neurodivergence to employers is that they're making sure that that perspective, that value is inherent in what's going on. They're not asking the neurodivergent person to constantly change to fit a system. They're helping to educate the employers on the uniqueness of each of the individuals and helping to empower them to be able to come in and really add to the community that they're coming to. So what are some of these methods that you all are using to match, to make sure that you're creating a successful opportunity when you're looking at neurodivergence in the workplace?
Right. So in the before times, the idea about a neurodivergent person in a professional environment and being successful in a professional environment was just basically, we had to do all the work. We had to do all the labor. We had to build a flawless mask, and we had to find a way to walk and talk and act like a normal person, which, if you're not wired like a normal person, is one of the most impossible things to do flawlessly. Look, I have a PhD in experimental physics. It was not an easy or trivial thing to get that. That took years and years of hard work and study and toil and effort to get that PhD. It is not hyperbole for me to say it was easier for me to get that PhD than it was for me to learn how to have a conversation with a stranger at a party. The thing that the neuromajority don't seem to realize is that the things that are easy for them are easy because their brain is wired. Their instincts and just their natures are doing a lot of heavy lifting. And what they don't realize or understand is that if you're missing some of those instincts or they work differently, to artificially recreate that is a fiendishly complex process. I would say it's probably more complicated than fluid dynamics. It's just, and I'm okay at it. I can do pretty well at it, but it never gets easy. When I'm interacting with the neuromajority, I'm constantly monitoring not only what they said, but what they might have meant, because again, normal people use language wrong all the time. I'm trying to pay attention to their body language. I'm trying to pay attention to what they said before. I'm trying to pay attention to what similar people have said in the past, and then I figured out what they were actually meaning. So there's like these algorithms running in my head, and I'm trying to do all this while at the same time following along with the conversation and stuff. It's fiendishly complex. It's fiendishly difficult. There's only so much human interaction I can stand before I don't want to see a human being. I just need to come home and turtle up and spend some high quality days of alone time to sort of like recharge and re-energize. So I can be good at masking, but it never gets easy. Now, what we're arguing at the Frist Center is that old system, which is one of the reasons why we have 80% unemployed and underemployed, doesn't work well. We think now, and there have been some autistic self-advocates who are like, it should be the opposite. We should get to be our authentic, unfiltered selves, and then everybody else should just have to do all the labor to come and meet us. Well, I don't agree with that, because it's just as hard for the neuromajority to meet us where we're at as it is hard for us to meet them where they're at. And I don't think the answer to a difficult, painful thing is like, let's make the other side do a difficult, painful thing. That to me is not a viable solution. I believe the best way is that we meet somewhere in the middle. Yeah. That we do need to learn some masking. I do need to learn one of the most painful but important lessons for me to learn is that many human beings can be traumatized and hurt simply by hearing me utter facts. Like, as I say that to you, intellectually, I've known it because I've done the research. I have the life experiences. I've seen the data for me is overwhelming. That's just a true statement. But emotionally, that does not make sense to me. If you tell me a fact that I don't like or I don't want to hear, like, I don't like the fact, I don't like the reality, but I don't associate that negative feeling with you. Like, I don't judge you harshly for that. In fact, if I study it and it turns out that you were factual and correct, I value and appreciate that you gave me a bit of wisdom there, a bit of difficult to swallow pill kind of thing. So I was always like running around just like pointing out when people were wrong and pointing out when people were flawed, and people were not reacting the way I would react to that sort of thing. So I needed to learn that about people. I needed to be mindful about what I say and how I say it, how to behave in a professional environment such that I'm not ruffling feathers, I'm not upsetting and offending the people around me. On the contrary, I want to be like a good team player. I want to be someone that people feel comfortable turning to for help, that people feel is reliable. Like, I want to be a good member of the species. That requires on my part a lot of work. But if those people want me to walk and talk and act just like a normal person, I tell them, no, I'm not doing that anymore. You need to put in some work too. You've got to understand that as hard as I'm working to make sure that I don't upset or offend you or rub you the wrong way, you have to acknowledge that's hard for me. That's complex for me. And anytime a human being does something hard or complex, they make mistakes. So when I do make mistakes, you need to be a little bit more compassionate. Stop being so harsh and judgy, and if I can teach the people around me to be like that and to give me a little bit of wiggle room and give me a little bit of grace, we're going to get along fabulously. And we're going to do great things together. We're going to have fabulous, it's not that hard to get there. So to summarize in short is both sides need to work a little bit to try to meet somewhere in the middle. Now, why is all of this even important? Aside from the fact that this is the moral thing to do, it's the human thing to do, that it's unambiguously good or evil, this is on the side of good, and not wanting to do this or just wanting a segment of the population to crawl in a ditch and die, I think we can all agree it's just evil and wrong-headed. But let's set the moral things aside, because morals are not really what is not the primary motivator of every person out there. There is a lot of wasted potential from these folks. Autistic and neurodivergent people, they suck at some of the things that might be good for everybody else, but by the same token, we're really good at some things that most people are not good at. And if you get the right mind and the right environment with the right supports, it can run circles around most people. It can really do great things. We have a lot of valuable contributions. And for me, the most famous example of that is Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, I mean, he passed before autism was even a formal diagnosis. But if you look at his childhood, you look at his sensory issues, you look at his social disabilities, you look at his life and his words and his actions and his deeds, he walked and talked and acted just like an autistic adult. Even his challenges, even his employment challenges were very autistic. I mean, the greatest physicist of the 20th century could not get a job as a physicist after he got his PhD, had to get a job as a patent clerk. That is such a typical underemployment sort of thing. He fell into the 80% underemployment. So luckily for us, he was so brilliant and so amazing that after his second Nobel Prize worthy paper had come out, only then did the universities go, oh, wait a minute, the greatest physicist of our time is a patent clerk. Maybe we should offer the guy as a job as a physicist. I don't think anybody could argue that Einstein was not a really good physicist. He was one of the best. I mean, if he'd only been 1/10 what he was, he would have still made a damn fine physicist. And yet the world almost lost him because of his weirdness, because of his eccentricities, because of his difference. And so, this is the thing that keeps me up at night. How many Einsteins are we losing right now? And not even at the Einstein level, but you have a place of business. You're hiring people to do things and stuff. There is probably some neurodivergent talent out there that if you properly understood it, you would be salivating to be able to get them on your team and stuff.
Yep.
Any one of you out there that's listening, you would be fortunate to have me on your team.
Yeah.
Like that's the level of dedication and drive. Like my autism in some ways is a superpower when it comes to getting work done. So if you want to think about this from a purely greed perspective, it's trying to get the right mind in the right place. It ends up benefiting us all as a society.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're nurturing and cultivating and you're doing it appropriately, is that you're hopefully empowering everyone, and then the overall good, the aggregate of all of that is that you have this wonderful working organism. But even what you were talking about earlier about the facts and meeting halfway, there's so many companies out there and so many organizations that don't have the people willing to give the facts because they are probably neurotypical and not willing to share always because of that emotional reciprocity. I think that it is something where, you can learn from somebody who's neurodivergent that being empowered with all these facts is a helpful thing for a company. And if somebody can deliver that fact and accept the fact and meet in the middle constantly, say you have a way to problem solve. You have a way to continuously improve and become better. So I think that even in that example that you gave, it's a good illustration of where the company needs to come halfway. And if the employee can come halfway, is that you've got this perfect kind of melting pot of something that is going to really explode with flavor over time. It's going to be a good recipe. But when we're talking about that, that's hard. And it is something that workplaces are not always equipped for. And it's not going to be a magic wand that's going to change every manager to be able to do that. It's not going to change all the colleagues to be able to do that. So are there trainings out there? Are there companies that are actually looking for this information to be able to become better at it so they can improve and take the benefits like you talked about?
And so those challenges and issues that you just described, and excellent job with that, very eloquent. I like that. I like that particular phrasing of words. That is a core reason why the Frist Center exists, and that's a core part of our efforts. I mean, you've seen like the driving simulator and other things, but we also partnership with a growing number of companies to help them become more neurodivergent inclusive within their organization. In the early days, it started off with companies that already had a proven track record, like Specialist Sterna. Over 75% of their employees are on the spectrum. They're a successful for-profit company. They have employees crushing it, high performing, high output employees. One I'm thinking about in particular was in his 40s with a master's degree, never had a full-time job. The first full-time job he had was working for Specialist Sterna, and now he's crushing it, and he's earning the company a lot of money and stuff. And so in the early days, it was talking to companies like that. What is your secret sauce? What are you doing different? What did you change to the workplace that these people are able to thrive and be successful? What did you change about the interview process? What did you change about the selection process? But in the last 5 or so years, our efforts have shifted more and more to other companies that want to be the next Specialist Sterna, or even just want to better accommodate and include the neurodivergent talent within their spaces. Some of the earliest people that are jumping on board with that has been the tech industries. So overwhelmingly, the companies we're currently working closely with is in the tech field, computer science, coding, stuff like that. Because people look at Silicon Valley and they look at all the billionaires and millionaires who are autistic, and it sparks something. Oh, wait, maybe there's something to this autism. Maybe this autism thing is capable of solving things and figuring new things out. And so some of the earliest people to come on board with like, yeah, we already recognize autism potential. Now, how do we make it work? Has been in the tech industry. But in recent years, we're starting to see an expansion of that into other sectors and stuff as well. So I'm not too worried about the companies who want to just do things old school and say, this is how we've always done it and we'll always do it this way. I mean, eventually they'll go out of business. Eventually they'll flop and fail. Like I'm going to focus on the ones who are trying to do better, because when they do better and they actually succeed, not just give themselves a talking point or something that makes them look good to the public, but actually some real substantial changes to the workplace, it doesn't just help the neurodivergent people. It turns out over and over again, when we make changes to the workplace to be more accommodating and inclusive for somebody like me, the normal people say, this is better. This works better. I like this more. I'm more motivated. I'm more comfortable. I'm more effective at my job. It turns out the thing that's preventing us from succeeding is kind of bugging everybody else. And so those companies that are doing sincere advancements in this field have a happier, more productive workforce. As a consequence of that, they're probably going to outcompete their competitors. And so at some point, they're going to look at the ones who are doing the best and go, what are you doing different? Oh, you've got a neurodivergent. Well, we need to do something like that too. So I expect that to kind of wash itself out in the coming decades.
Yeah, I from doing this podcast is that I keep learning that same example, is that most of the things that we're looking at and we're saying, this would be better for a neurodivergent experience, or this would be better for a cultural experience for the entire group. It's like most often, these are things that are just good ways to interact. They're just good ways to be able to create a safe space. They're great ways to create a wonderful culture that's supporting and brings out wonderful products, initiatives, innovations, ideas. And
absolutely. I mean, what you're alluding to there is the fact that if you have a team of people where those people have different experiences, different perspectives, different viewpoints, different ways of solving problems, and that team is able to effectively communicate and work together, they're far more robust and capable, as opposed to another team where everybody sings kumbaya and gets along really well and they're all on the same wavelength, but they all think the same and they all have the same sorts of solutions. That team is less adaptable. So this strategy for incorporating an autistic person would also work for autism or dyslexia or dyspraxia or ADHD, or someone from another culture, or someone from a different background, or someone from a different part of the world. This whole let's try to find commonalities and let's find a way where we can authentically communicate effectively with each other, and then let's rely upon the real true heart and soul of the human species, which is this desire and need to form collaborations, to form partnerships, to be a part of a group, to be a productive member of that group, to be accommodating and supportive to the people, to lend our strengths to the ones around us who aren't as good at this one thing that we are, so we have value, and then rely upon the group around us to help us with the things we're not good at. That is humanity at its pinnacle, right? That's when we're at our absolute best. And this is just a simple, common sense strategy for helping us realize that.
Absolutely. And you shouldn't have to wait to be a neurodivergent billionaire or two-time Nobel Prize winner to be able to get there. But as you're talking through that, I mean, I can hear the technology of, what are some of the systems that can be worked into a workplace? What are some of the ways that we're interacting in the workplace? But there are also some ways to be able to accommodate a workplace, to be able to strengthen it, that there's got to be ways to be able to bring technology into the workplace to be able to allow somebody to be their best self. Have you seen some of these things in action, or are you involved in the creation of some of these?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll give you one obvious example. That the 2020 pandemic was tragic and horrible in so many ways, and we all collectively sort of struggled through that time period. But I'm always looking at all the variables in the equation, not just the good or the bad. One of the real positives for me that came out of the pandemic is that many more people today now know that in some regimes it is possible to work from home. It is possible to have virtual meetings instead of in-person meetings and stuff. That excites me, not only for the autism community, but also for the disability community. There are some people who have a lot to offer, who have meaningful contributions, who could be valuable and productive and useful on a team, that are currently barred from contributing because of this outdated idea that you have to physically be in the same space, breathing the same air to be able to get work done. I know for the average human being that's important because of socialization and the ability to connect with one another, and you don't really feel like you're a part of the team unless you're there, and like not just working but saying, how was last Thursday or whatever, or how was that trip you went on, that sort of social bonding and stuff that's so important for the neuromajority to be able to form that social glue. I get that there's a lot of reasons why some people prefer in person, let's all be in the same physical space, but you have to recognize that doesn't work for everybody. There's a minority of us that really could benefit from a hybrid structure or even a virtual structure. That if you expand that capability and you accommodate and include those people, that might be the person who has the one idea that breaks the whole project wide open and ends up getting the project to successful conclusion and stuff. So people don't realize it, but they actually want that. And before the pandemic, everybody was saying, well, it's just not technologically possible.
Mm-hmm.
The pandemic took that argument off the table. When we didn't have a choice, we figured out how to make it work. And now as a society, we know how it works. We know how to make that work. And that was one of the underpinnings to that. So that's an example of a technology, this Zoom function, Microsoft Teams or whatever it's called, you know, like all these platforms and stuff where we can have a meeting and you're in one part of the world and I'm in the other part of the world and we can see each other, we can read each other's body language, we can share materials with each other. That's huge. That's absolutely huge for certain segments of our population. It's a game changer.
Yeah. And then once again, something that not only helps with neurodivergent communities, but it also helps with so many other communities that you already illustrated. And it's like, it's a lot of these ideas are so inclusive, and the fact that it's helping so many different people out there to be able to be empowered in the workplace. What are some of the resources that folks can turn to? Because I mean, you've been doing this work. You have all this at your fingertips. Others don't. Even workplaces that want to get better don't always have all the resources.
So when we first started this business, we found that what existed out there were in these tiny little silos. I'll never forget my first trip to New Jersey. I was working with a few organizations up there. I found an organization that was trying to build a tool to serve their autistic high school students, and not 30 miles away was another organization that built that exact tool to serve their students. They didn't know about each other. They didn't like. I was able to kind of help them make that connection. So hey, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. These other people have already done it, and it works pretty well. So even from the early days, we started thinking of the Frist Center as a nexus point. So we're keenly interested in any tools, technologies, ways of doing things, strategies, trainings, schooling, whatever that might help this issue. We want to find out about it. We want to learn about it. We want to study it. We want to put the lens of science to figure out, does this really work? In what ways does this really work? What does that teach us about this population? So then we can take that deeper understanding in some of our other efforts. But another side of that is that we're probably one of the most, if not the most well-connected organizations in terms of autism and employment, neurodivergence and employment that exist in the world today. We know most of the players. I'm not going to sit here and tell you we know all of them, but we know a pretty good number of those. And so we're actually a great first stop for that. If you have a question for autism and employment, you can go to our website. We put tools and resources up on the website. We regularly update it, keep it up to date. I've been told as a university website that's unusual, but I consider that as a primary vehicle or mechanism for getting these best practices in the hands of people, making it as accessible and easy to understand as possible. So we have a lot of that. If you are a company or a business that's looking in this direction, if you're a manager who suspects that you have an autistic employee and you're trying to figure out the best way to manage them and resolve some conflicts or issues that you might have, if you suspect that you're neurodivergent and you're struggling with employment, you know, any one of those people, they can go to the Frist Center and they can look at our information. And if they want to talk to us, they can find contact information for Colette, my program manager, talk to her. She'll schedule a sit down with me. I'll sit down and chat with them, get a feel for who are you, what are you looking for, and then I'll point you towards some resources and stuff. The dirty little secret of why we've been successful and why we've been able to do so much is that we're not doing it all. Like we're more just like connecting people. The vast majority of tools and resources we're offering, we didn't make those. Like other people made those, and we always give proper accreditation and credit for that. So we think of ourselves as sort of like a nexus point for these resources and stuff that then we're then trying to think of, how do we get these in the hands of the people who need them? So we're very collaborative. We're very open. We're very happy to chat with people. I just earlier today, just before this meeting, I was chatting with an individual who is, he has a job, he has full-time employment, but he's not really happy there. He just found out that he was autistic. He's starting to put into words why he's unhappy and what kind of job he's looking for that would be probably a better fit to his personality and probably be more engaging and worthwhile and productive to do. I loved having that conversation. I added him to my database. That is another data point of a real life person with real life issues that now I have some understanding of the size and scale and scope of the issue. So when I'm talking to these individuals, hopefully they're getting something of benefit out of it where we're helping them. But I do not consider that a waste of time. I consider that time well spent. If I can figure out your issues and help you figure out a way to solve it, it doesn't just help you. Potentially that lays out a roadmap for everybody out there who's like you with a similar problem.
Well, I mean, you all have created such a wonderful resource, and Dave, I appreciate you giving us some of your time and being able to share your experiences. But before we wrap up, I do want to give the floor back to you on this, because this is something you've put so much energy into. Your passion is there, your lived experience is there. So I do want to just ask is that if you were to have one key takeaway, one thing that our listeners walk away from this podcast, what is the one thing that you want them to gain from your insights and experience?
The idea that there is a normal brain is a myth, or a normal typical human being does not exist. The term neurodiversity itself was coined to bring attention to this fact. The fact that there are variances in our capabilities. We all have strengths and weaknesses. We all have preferences. We all have modes of thinking that are really good for us and some that are difficult and not very useful for us. That's normal. Not everybody sees the world the way you do. Not everyone experiences the world the way you do. And these people out there who have a perspective that there's only two types of perspectives in the world, my way and the wrong way, you're wrong-headed. You're just, no, it's not a question of which perspective is right and which perspective is wrong. Every perspective has value. It might be mistaken, it might be flawed, it might be missing things, but perspectives have value. And finding a way to get different perspectives to effectively share and learn from each other is one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves as human beings.
Well, Dr. Dave, we appreciate that, and that is very insightful. So I appreciate that you were able to answer that last question for us. But thanks for joining us again, and hopefully we can get you back on the podcast to talk about these issues and to be able to dig even deeper in the future.
Yeah, I'm always delighted to talk about these things. I can't believe they pay me to do this job. I just love doing this sort of stuff. I mean, this is one of my passions. This is something I'm motivated in. It's a very rewarding and fulfilling sort of thing. Always happy to help in whatever way I can that can help move the needle in the right direction. And I'll add one additional thing, which is this. I've been saying this every year, and it's been true every year since the first year. It's never been a better time in this country to be an autistic adult than today. We have many more programs, many more expansions, tools, and resources. Next year will be better than today. And that's such a rewarding and fulfilling thing to be a part of.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.